Thank you very much. So let's just sort of take a quick trip around the world here. How many, there are 27 nations in the European Union, there are 28 countries in NATO. I'm not asking for this today, but on my side, I want to make sure that the Republican Party is out there leading, working with other nations to build up systems to keep all of us safe, keep people fed that need to be fed, and better health care so that countries don't collapse and we wind up having to pay the price of that collapse. You have counterparts in virtually every one of those nations, is that correct?
The substantial donors specifically, but foreign ministers often take both tasks.
Can you do me a favor? You don't have to do it today, but give me some indication of what other countries are doing in comparison to us. Because when David Beasley was here with the World Food Program, he said that Saudi Arabia had given them like $11 million and the UAE was zero. So that kind of stood out to me. I try to tell the taxpayers back home that you pay now or you pay later in these areas. Let's get in on the ground, shape events rather than being overwhelmed by them. But there's also a legitimate concern by all Americans that are we doing this by ourselves? So we got to make the case that other nations are helping, and when they're not, we got to make them help. Does that make sense to you?
It does, Senator.
Okay, all right. So we'll go to work on that, Mr. Chairman, and see if we can come up with some dynamic of how the other world, how parts of the developed democracy world is doing compared to us. Been pushing an idea about a global fund for food security. Does that make sense to you?
I think more resources for food security makes sense. We should talk about the modalities, just particularly given some, I think, important positive developments that align with your first question comment, like the World Bank setting up a $30 billion resilience and solidarity fund, the modalities of which we're still digging into to understand how that's going to be used. So something that coordinates bilateral donor assistance, the multilateral development banks, both regional and global, like the World Bank, could be very important. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to be helpful there. I want to let the taxpayer know that we're pushing other countries to do more when they can do more and should do more, and we'll say thank you to those who are, doing their part and then some. We sent a letter to you 4 months ago, myself and Senator Risch, regarding USAID's efforts to hunt for and research novel viruses, including in China. We haven't gotten a response. Can you please answer our letter?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, the bottom line for me about Afghanistan is, can you think of a scenario of where we help the Central Bank of Afghanistan without the Taliban being benefited?
Senator, right now, I certainly see grounds for skepticism, given that the Central Bank of Afghanistan is run by a Taliban minister.
Right.
But at the same time, with the country's economy unraveling, with the central bank for any country,
Let me ask you, was that a predictable consequence of our withdrawal?
Was what a predictable
That the country
consequence?
would fall apart under Taliban control?
Well, I think that there were views that have been talked about up here that the Afghan forces would be able to withstand.
When you have a list of the pluses and minuses, one of the minuses had to be that the Taliban get in charge of the country, go to hell in a handcart.
I think I can't speak for the president here today, but I think,
from your lane, were you worried about that? If we,
I think all of us who care about the Afghan people, of course, were worried about the consequences that would ensue, with any.
Are you surprised the Afghans, the Taliban, are not letting girls go to school in a robust way?
Well, let me just say that, am I surprised compared to what I thought of the Taliban before they took power? Of course not. That's their worldview. That's their ideology. They made no secret of that. Am I surprised? I'm not at all surprised when they break their word, but they had, in fact, committed to work with UNICEF and other international actors to allow donors to bypass the education ministry to be able to support girls to be able to be in school. And so, as you know, they went back on a commitment that they had made and that we thought we were going to be
So
able to
here's the
actually continue to support girls in school.
Given their history, I'm not surprised, and I share your concern about the Afghan people, they're living in hell. So if you can find a way to convince me of how we can get outside organizations effectively working in Afghanistan to keep people from starving, I'll be willing to help. So finally, when we look at what's on the horizon through the end of this year going into the next, I hate to be a Debbie Downer here, but 40 countries rely up to 50% of their grain supply comes from Ukraine, and most of them are in the developing world. I don't see the war in Ukraine ending anytime soon. Famines have hit Africa in unprecedented levels. Are we ready for this? We've had a supplemental, but how do we deal with this? What's your advice to this committee? Because, everybody doesn't want to spend any more money than we have to, but I just don't see a way out of dealing with this, Mr. Chairman, without putting some resources in the pipeline. Now we're in with this. America's national security interests are well served when there's a certain amount of stability in the world, but we can't do it by ourselves. So will you pledge to this committee not only to give us sound advice about how we can do more efficiently, save some money in other places, but also how we can push the world to do their part? So what do you see for the next year?
Well, let me say this, Senator, first, just underscoring the premise of your question, which is, according to the World Bank, 10 million people are thrust into poverty for every 1% increase in food prices. And food prices are already up 34%, but, given Putin's blockade of the grains and sunflower oil and other oils coming out of Ukraine, there's no guarantee that has capped. So I've a former UN ambassador, I very much share the predicate for your whole kind of line of inquiry, which is we need to leverage what we do to get other countries to do more. I do think that the Europeans have stepped up, both in terms of, opening their doors and hearts and homes and resources to Ukrainians who've crossed into Europe. Unfortunately, though, and I'm not sure how closely everybody is tracking this, in many European budgetary processes, the resources to help Ukrainian refugees are coming out of overseas development assistance. And so if you combine that with the cuts that we've seen from the United Kingdom over the last year and what we know are going to be the demands inside Ukraine around reconstruction, but also just around tending to the acute needs of people who are still under siege and who've been displaced, I worry about a shrinking pie, and it places a premium on getting new donors or donors who have contributed. Saudi Arabia was increasing steadily its contributions every year to humanitarian assistance, and then that tapered off and now has dropped. They have made substantial new announcements for Yemen, which is very useful because there's so many needs in so many places. And so, particular countries are going to have particular parts of the world that they maybe feel a closer attachment to. But what everyone needs to do is to do what you have done, which is to recognize that we're in an extra budgetary moment. We are, if we're just, taking money out of our food security programming in order to, to support energy diversification so that people can wean themselves off dependence on Putin's energy, that's not going to work. If we are not supporting journalists who are uncovering the crimes and corruption of their leaders, that's a big loss, because this is a moment in which when people feel the needs that they are feeling, they have a right to democratic accountability, and we should be supporting that aspiration that they have. So, everything is connected to everything else, and we can't, I know you alluded to this in your opening comment, Senator, I wasn't sure exactly what you meant, but it would be a huge missed opportunity for the United States to give up also on the incredibly effective COVID-19 work that we have been doing. I mean, from your travels, you must see the gratitude, the fact that our vaccines and our PPE and our therapeutics and tests don't come with strings attached. They're not in exchange for, some country doing this back or taking on some debt to us. These are donations. These come out of the generosity and compassion and self-interest of the American people. People understand that connection. But to emphasize food security and give up on COVID, that can't be an option, right? Given that the food security crisis predated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in part because of what COVID has done to supply chains around the world.
One quick question, I got to go. What's the vaccination rate in Africa? Do you know?
Excuse me. It's around 17%.
Yeah, so we all agree that's slow, but I don't see it changing much for a variety of factors. So one thing that people on our side of the aisle think about, Ms. Chairman, is therapeutics, is to keep people out of hospital, get them well as quick as possible. So I hope that, this combination that we're talking about for COVID would look at therapeutics.